The champagne glass trembled slightly in my hand as I stood at the edge of the crowded ballroom, watching my college roommates laugh and gesture animatedly around the mahogany bar. The reunion was everything I'd expected. Expensive suits, name-dropping, and that familiar undercurrent of competition disguised as friendship. 20 years had passed since we'd all walked across that graduation stage together, and now here we were, successful professionals showing off our achievements like peacocks displaying their feathers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah, there you are. Marcus Wellington's voice boomed across the room as he approached, his Armani suit perfectly tailored, his smile as calculated as ever. We were just talking about career paths. You know, comparing notes on who's climbed the highest corporate ladders. He gestured toward the group. Tech executives, investment bankers, surgeons, the usual suspects. I nodded politely, the familiar weight of judgment settling over me like a heavy cloak. Behind Marcus, I could see Jennifer Chen whispering something to David Rodriguez, both of them glancing my way with those patronizing smiles I'd grown accustomed to over the years. And you, Marcus continued, his tone shifting to something that sounded almost sympathetic. You're still in the military, right? Same old Sarah, still playing soldier after all these years. The words hung in the air like smoke. Still playing soldier. As if 2 decades of service was nothing more than an extended childhood game. I felt my phone vibrate in my evening clutch, a message I'd been expecting all night. I pulled it out discreetly and glanced at the screen. Operation Nightfall mission parameters confirmed. Full deployment authorization granted. Signed, Joint Chiefs of Staff. I slipped the phone back into my purse and looked up at Marcus, my expression unchanged. He had no idea. None of them did. While they'd been climbing corporate ladders and chasing stock options, I'd been climbing mountains in Afghanistan, leading covert operations in Syria, and briefing presidents in the Situation Room. But tonight they would finally understand exactly who Sarah Mitchell really was. Something like that, I said quietly, taking a sip of champagne as the room buzzed with the kind of laughter that comes from people who think they know everything about everyone. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. Growing up in suburban Denver, Colorado, I learned early that being different wasn't always celebrated. The Mitchell family was solidly middle class. My father, Robert, worked as a high school history teacher, and my mother, Linda, was a nurse at the local hospital. We lived in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street, where the biggest excitement was usually the annual neighborhood barbecue and the occasional drama over property lines. My parents were good people, hardworking and honest, but they had very specific ideas about what success looked like. It involved college, a stable career, marriage, kids, and a house with a white picket fence. The American dream, packaged and delivered exactly as advertised. My older brother Kevin had followed this blueprint perfectly. MBA from Northwestern, finance job in Chicago, wife, 2 kids, and a suburban mansion that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Then there was me. Even as a child, I was drawn to structured discipline and challenges that most people would consider impossible. While other kids played with dolls or video games, I was building elaborate obstacle courses in our backyard, timing myself as I crawled under ropes and climbed over makeshift walls. My parents thought it was a phase. Kevin thought it was weird. Why can't you just be normal? He'd ask, watching me practice military-style push-ups at age 12. Other girls your age are interested in makeup and boys. But I wasn't other girls. I was fascinated by military history, by stories of courage under fire, by the idea that some people dedicated their entire lives to serving something bigger than themselves. I read biographies of generals like Patton and MacArthur, studied battle strategies from World War II, and dreamed of a life where every day mattered, where the decisions you made could literally save lives. My parents tolerated my interests, but they never really understood them. At dinner conversations, when Kevin would talk about his latest business deal, or his plans for expanding his investment portfolio, my contributions about military tactics or current international conflicts were met with polite nods and subtle subject changes. Sarah's going through her tomboy phase, my mother would explain to relatives, as if my passion for military service was something I'd outgrow, like braces or acne. She'll settle down eventually. High school was where the real divide began to show. While my classmates were focused on prom dates and college applications to prestigious universities, I was already planning my path to the military academy. I spent hours in the gym, not to look good in a prom dress, but to meet the physical requirements for service. I studied not just for good grades, but to understand the world I hoped to one day help protect. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Peterson, was well-meaning but completely out of her depth when it came to my ambitions. "Have you considered nursing?" she'd suggest during our meetings. "Or maybe teaching, like your father. You have excellent leadership qualities. You could be a principal someday." The assumption was always the same, that my interest in military service was really just leadership skills that could be better applied to appropriate civilian careers. No one seemed to consider that maybe I actually wanted to serve my country, not because I couldn't think of anything better to do, but because I couldn't think of anything more important. When I announced my intention to apply to West Point, the reaction was swift and predictable. My parents were concerned, my brother was dismissive, and my extended family was bewildered. At my cousin Jennifer's wedding that summer, I became the center of uncomfortable conversations. "The military?" my Aunt Carol had said, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if I'd announced plans to join a cult. "But you're so smart, Sarah. You could do anything." The implication was clear. Smart people didn't choose military service. Smart people chose careers that made money, that came with prestige, that looked good on Christmas cards. The military was what you did if you couldn't cut it in the real world. Even my closest friends from high school didn't understand. Rachel and Amanda, who I'd known since elementary school, treated my decision like a temporary rebellion. "You'll change your mind," Rachel had said confidently. "Once you get to college and see what else is out there, you'll realize there are better options." But I didn't change my mind. I threw myself into the application process with the same intensity I'd brought to everything else. Physical training at 5 a.m., academic excellence, leadership roles in student government, volunteer work with veterans organizations. I wasn't just applying to West Point, I was preparing for a life of service. The day my acceptance letter arrived, I felt a surge of pride and validation that I'd never experienced before. I'd done it. I'd earned my place at one of the most prestigious military academies in the world. But when I shared the news with my family, the response was more complicated than I'd hoped. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," my mother had said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "But are you sure this is what you want? It's such a big commitment." My father had been more direct. 4 years of military academy, then at least 5 years of active duty. That's nearly a decade of your life, Sarah. What about marriage? What about kids? What about a normal life? Normal. There was that word again, the measuring stick by which all my choices were evaluated. Kevin had been more blunt during a family dinner a few weeks later. "I just don't get it," he'd said, cutting into his steak with unnecessary force. "You're throwing away your potential. You could go to any university, study business or law, make real money. Instead, you're choosing to take orders from people who are probably less intelligent than you are." I'd tried to explain that it wasn't about taking orders. It was about learning to give them. That leadership in the military was different from leadership in the corporate world. That some things were more important than money or social status. But my words fell on deaf ears. The pattern was set. My family loved me, but they saw my choice as a mistake, a detour from the path that would lead to real success. They were supportive in their way, but it was the kind of support you give someone who's making a well-intentioned but ultimately misguided decision. They were waiting for me to come to my senses, to realize that playing soldier was no substitute for a real career. As I packed my bags for West Point that August, I felt the weight of their expectations and their disappointment. But I also felt something else, a quiet determination to prove that their definition of success wasn't the only one that mattered. I was 18 years old, and I was about to begin a journey that would take me places they couldn't even imagine. The last thing Kevin said to me before I left was, "Well, at least you'll get the military stuff out of your system. 4 years from now, you'll be ready for a real job." He couldn't have been more wrong. 4 years from then, I'd be just getting started. Pretty setty. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. West Point hit me like a tsunami on day one. The gray stone buildings loomed against the Hudson River like ancient fortresses, and the weight of history pressed down on every cadet who walked through those gates. This wasn't just a college. This was where America forged its military leaders, where young men and women were transformed from civilians into officers who would one day command thousands. My roommate was Jessica Torres from El Paso, Texas, a sharp-tongued engineering prodigy whose father had served 3 tours in Iraq. Unlike me, she came from a military family where service was expected, not questioned. On our first night, as we made our beds with hospital corners and arranged our sparse belongings in regulation order, she looked at me with curious eyes. "Let me guess," she said, folding her uniform with mechanical precision. "Your family thinks you've lost your mind." I paused in hanging up my cadet gray uniform. "How'd you know?" "Because mine would think the same thing if they weren't military. Civilians don't get it. They think we're here because we couldn't get into Harvard or Yale." She sat on her perfectly made bed and studied me. "What's your story, Mitchell? Why are you really here?" It was the first time anyone had asked me that question without an underlying assumption that my answer would be inadequate. Over the next 4 years, Jessica would become more than my roommate. She'd become my first real understanding of what military brotherhood actually meant. The academic rigor at West Point made my high school honors classes look like elementary worksheets. Engineering mechanics, military history, constitutional law, foreign languages. Every course was designed not just to educate us, but to forge critical thinking under pressure. Our professors weren't just teachers. They were active duty officers who'd commanded troops in real combat zones, who'd made life and death decisions in the mountains of Afghanistan and the deserts of Iraq. Colonel Patricia Hawkins taught my favorite class, strategic military leadership. She was a lean woman with steel gray eyes who'd led a battalion during the surge in Iraq. And she had no patience for theoretical discussions divorced from reality. On the first day of class, she stood before us in her dress blue uniform, her chest decorated with ribbons that told the story of a career spent in harm's way. "Leadership isn't about giving orders," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned respect in the hardest possible circumstances. "It's about making decisions when you don't have enough information, under conditions where failure means people die. Anyone can manage a quarterly budget report. How many of you can manage a firefight in Fallujah, where your choices determine whether your soldiers go home to their families?" The room fell silent. This wasn't business school. This wasn't about profit margins or market share. This was about life and death, about the weight of command, about responsibility that most people would never understand. During my sophomore year, I started receiving emails from Kevin that revealed just how little my family understood about what I was actually doing. He'd forward me job postings for entry-level positions at his investment firm, along with notes like, "Just in case you want to transfer somewhere more practical." My mother would send care packages filled with fashion magazines and makeup samples, as if my real problem was that I wasn't feminine enough for military service. The most painful communication came during Thanksgiving break of my junior year. I was home for just 4 days. But those 4 days crystallized everything that was wrong with how my family viewed my choices. At dinner, surrounded by extended family, my Uncle Mark, who managed a car dealership, decided to enlighten me about the real world. "The thing about the military," he announced over turkey and stuffing, gesturing with his fork for emphasis, "is that it's a young person's game. You do your 4 years, get some discipline, maybe learn a skill, and then you transition to a real career. The smart ones don't make it a lifetime thing." My Aunt Susan nodded sagely. "Exactly. It's like Peace Corps or AmeriCorps, something you do to build character before you settle down and start making actual money." I sat there, cutting my turkey into precise pieces, listening to them reduce my life's ambition to a gap-year program for wayward youth. My cousin Bradley, who'd just graduated from business school, jumped into the conversation with the confidence of someone who'd read exactly one article about military compensation. "The pay structure is terrible too," he added. "I mean, what's a colonel make? Maybe 60,000? I'll be making twice that in my first year at the consulting firm." What none of them understood, what they couldn't understand, was that by then, I was already distinguishing myself in ways that would have shocked them. My tactical exercises scores were in the top 5% of my class. I'd been selected for advanced leadership training during summer breaks, working alongside active duty officers on real operational planning. My professors weren't just giving me good grades. They were recommending me for fast-track programs that most cadets never even heard about. Colonel Hawkins had pulled me aside after a particularly challenging strategic planning exercise, where I'd had to coordinate a simulated multi-unit operation in hostile territory. "Mitchell," she'd said, her tone serious, "I've been doing this for 22 years, and I've taught thousands of cadets. You have something special. You see the big picture, but you never lose sight of the human element. That's rare." But at family dinner, I was just Sarah the soldier, still playing dress-up in someone else's uniform. The breaking point came during my senior year, when I received notification that I'd been selected for the Intelligence Officer Advanced course, a program that would place me in the fast track for strategic command positions. It was an honor that maybe 20 cadets out of thousands received each year, a recognition that the Army saw leadership potential that could eventually reach the highest levels of command. I called home to share the news, expecting at least acknowledgement of the achievement. Instead, my father's response was, "That's nice, honey. Have you given any more thought to law school? Your mother and I have been talking, and we think you could still apply for next year if you change your mind about staying in the Army. Law school." After 4 years at West Point, after being selected for advanced intelligence training, after proving myself against the best and brightest cadets in the country, they still thought I was making a mistake that could be corrected with a career change. Kevin's reaction was even worse. "Intelligence officer? So basically, you're going to be a desk jockey in Washington, pushing papers around and briefing people who make the real decisions. Sarah, you're 22 years old. This is your life we're talking about. Don't you want something more than government pay and government housing?" What Kevin didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that intelligence officers weren't desk jockeys. We were the ones who gathered and analyzed the information that determined military strategy. We were the ones who briefed generals and sometimes presidents about threats to national security. We were the ones who worked in the shadows to prevent conflicts before they started, and when prevention failed, we were the ones who made sure our forces had every possible advantage. But explaining this to my family was like trying to describe color to someone who'd been blind their entire life. They had no framework for understanding that success could be measured in lives saved rather than dollars earned, that leadership could mean something more than climbing a corporate ladder. My graduation from West Point was a bittersweet day. My family came, and they were proud. I could see it in their faces as I walked across the stage to receive my commission as a second lieutenant. But their pride was tinged with resignation, as if they were watching me accept an award for something they'd rather I hadn't won. The most telling moment came at the reception afterward. A retired general who'd been my mentor throughout my senior year approached my parents to congratulate them. General Robert Foster was a legend in military circles, a man who'd commanded divisions in 3 different conflicts, and had been awarded every medal short of the Medal of Honor. "You should be incredibly proud of your daughter," he told my parents, his weathered face serious. In 35 years of military service, I've rarely seen a young officer with her combination of tactical intelligence and leadership instinct. Mark my words, if she stays with this career, you'll be reading about her accomplishments in history books. My father shook the general's hand politely and thanked him for his kind words. But later, as we walked to the parking lot, he turned to me with a sad smile. "That's all very nice, sweetheart, but generals have to say those things. It's part of their job to encourage young officers. The real question is what you're going to do with your life." As I stood there in my brand new officer's uniform, fresh out of one of the most prestigious military academies in the world, with a fast-track assignment to intelligence command, my father was still waiting for me to choose a real career. That night, alone in my quarters for the last time as a cadet, I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I wouldn't try to convince them anymore. I wouldn't send updates about my achievements or try to explain why my choices mattered. I would simply do my job, serve my country, and let my actions speak for themselves. 10 years later, when I stood in that reunion ballroom listening to Marcus Wellington call me "still playing soldier," I realized that my family's failure to understand my path had taught me something valuable about leadership. Sometimes the people closest to you are the least capable of seeing who you really are. Sometimes the only way to prove your worth is to stop trying to prove it and start demonstrating it in ways they can't ignore. But that demonstration was still years away. First, I had to earn it. My first assignment as a second lieutenant took me to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where I was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division's Intelligence Battalion. Fort Bragg wasn't just any military installation. It was home to some of the Army's most elite units, where the pace was faster, the standards higher, and the margin for error virtually non-existent. Walking through those gates for the first time as an officer, I felt the weight of my new gold bars like they were made of lead. My commanding officer was Major David Chen, a compact man with the weathered look of someone who'd spent more time in combat zones than conference rooms. He'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq, and he had a reputation for being harder on his junior officers than a drill sergeant was on new recruits. His philosophy was simple. If you couldn't handle pressure at Fort Bragg, you certainly couldn't handle it when bullets were flying. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said during my first briefing, his eyes scanning my file with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "West Point graduate, top 10% of your class, selected for advanced intelligence training. Impressive credentials." He closed the folder and looked directly at me. "Now forget all of that. Credentials don't mean anything here. Results do. Your job is to keep soldiers alive by providing accurate, actionable intelligence. Everything else is just noise." My first real test came during a joint training exercise with Special Forces units preparing for deployment to Afghanistan. The scenario was complex. A simulated hostage rescue operation in an urban environment, with multiple moving parts and constantly changing variables. My job was to coordinate intelligence feeds from various sources: satellite imagery, drone surveillance, human intelligence, and electronic intercepts, and provide real-time updates to the operational commanders. The exercise began at 04:00 hours on a cold February morning. Within the first hour, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Communication systems failed, weather conditions deteriorated, and the enemy forces proved more adaptive than anticipated. In the chaos, I found myself managing information flows that would determine whether the simulated mission succeeded or failed spectacularly. Captain James Rodriguez, the Special Forces team leader, was a veteran of multiple combat deployments with little patience for theoretical military exercises. When I radioed him with an update about enemy positions based on my analysis of incoming intelligence, his response was blunt. "Lieutenant, I don't care what your computers are telling you. My guys are reporting different positions. Which intel am I supposed to trust, yours or theirs?" It was a moment that crystallized everything I'd learned about leadership at West Point. I had 2 choices: defer to the more experienced captain's ground-level intelligence, or trust my analysis of the broader intelligence picture and potentially send his team into danger based on my assessment. In the real world, this decision could mean the difference between a successful mission and dead soldiers. I took a deep breath and keyed my radio. "Captain Rodriguez, I'm seeing patterns in the intelligence that suggest the enemy has repositioned to draw your team into a trap. Recommend you hold position for 60 seconds while I confirm with satellite imagery." 60 seconds could cost us the entire mission, Lieutenant. "Sir, if I'm right, 60 seconds could save your entire team." The longest minute of my military career followed. I frantically cross-referenced multiple intelligence sources, looking for confirmation of my analysis. Then I saw it. Thermal imaging showing a cluster of heat signatures in exactly the position I'd predicted. A classic L-shaped ambush formation. I immediately radioed the updated intelligence to Captain Rodriguez, who adjusted his team's approach accordingly. The exercise concluded with a successful mission and 0 simulated casualties. Afterward, Captain Rodriguez approached me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Lieutenant," he said, "I've been doing this for 8 years. I was ready to ignore your intelligence and trust my gut. If this had been real, my guys would probably be dead right now." He extended his hand. "That was solid work." Major Chen's debrief was more direct. "Mitchell, you just did something that most officers take years to learn. You trusted your analysis over the pressure to defer to more experienced voices. That's the difference between intelligence officers who provide information and intelligence officers who save lives. But back home, My family's perspective remained frustratingly unchanged. During a brief leave visit, Kevin announced over dinner that he'd been promoted to vice president at his investment firm. The conversation immediately turned to his salary increase, his new company car, and his plans to buy a bigger house in an even more exclusive suburb. "It's all about positioning yourself for the next opportunity," he explained, cutting into his steak with obvious satisfaction. "I'm already networking for a senior VP position at a bigger firm. Should be making mid-six figures within 2 years." When the conversation finally turned to me, the tone shifted noticeably. "And how's your little army adventure going, Sarah?" my Aunt Carol asked with what she probably thought was genuine interest. "Still enjoying playing war games?" Playing war games. I thought about Captain Rodriguez's team, about the weight of making decisions that could get real soldiers killed in real combat zones. I thought about the classified briefings I'd been attending, about the intelligence reports crossing my desk that dealt with actual threats to American interests around the world. But how do you explain that to people who think military service is an extended game of capture the flag? "It's going well," I said simply. "I'm learning a lot." "That's wonderful, dear," my mother said with that patronizing smile I'd grown to hate. "And you're still planning to get out after your commitment is up, right?" Kevin's firm is always looking for people with leadership experience. They love hiring former military. Former military. As if my service was already past tense, as if they were already planning my escape route from a career they couldn't understand or respect. The conversation that truly revealed their mindset came a few months later, when I called home to share news about my promotion to first lieutenant, a promotion that had come early due to my performance during the joint training exercises. Instead of congratulation, I got concern. "Promotion?" my father said, his voice carrying a note of worry. "Sarah, promotions mean more commitment, more time away from normal life. Are you sure you want to get more involved in this military thing?" More involved in this military thing. I was already an officer in the United States Army, already entrusted with classified information and the lives of soldiers under my command. How much more involved could I get? But to my family, each step forward in my military career was another step away from the life they'd planned for me, another delay in my inevitable return to civilian normalcy. The disconnect became even more pronounced when I was selected for deployment to Afghanistan as part of Operation Enduring Freedom. The deployment would last 15 months and would place me in a forward operating base where I'd be responsible for intelligence operations supporting combat missions throughout the region. It was exactly the kind of assignment that could define a military career, the kind of real-world experience that separated theoretical knowledge from practical expertise. My family's reaction was swift and predictable. My mother cried. My father immediately started researching ways to get me transferred to a safer assignment. Kevin called it unnecessary risk for a job that doesn't even pay well. None of them seemed to understand that this wasn't just my job. This was my calling, my chance to serve my country in a meaningful way during one of the most challenging periods in recent military history. The most painful conversation came from my mother 3 weeks before my deployment. She called me crying, begging me to reconsider my commitment to the Army. "Sarah," she sobbed, "this isn't worth dying for. You could have a safe, normal life. You could meet someone, get married, have children. Why are you throwing all of that away for strangers who don't even appreciate what you're doing? Strangers who don't even appreciate what you're doing." She was talking about American soldiers, about men and women who'd volunteered to serve their country, who depended on intelligence officers like me to keep them alive in hostile territory. To her they were strangers. To me they were brothers and sisters in arms, people whose lives mattered more than my comfort or safety. But I didn't try to explain that to her. I'd learned by then that some gaps in understanding are too wide to bridge with words. Instead, I told her I loved her, that I'd be careful, and that I was proud to serve. Then I hung up and finished packing for Afghanistan, knowing that when I returned, if I returned, I'd be a different person with experiences my family would never comprehend. 3 days before deployment, Major Chen called me into his office for a final briefing. "Mitchell," he said, "you're about to see things that will change you forever. You're going to make decisions that carry real weight, that have real consequences. Some of your choices will save lives. Others might cost them. That's the burden of command. And it only gets heavier as you advance in rank. He paused, studying my face for any sign of doubt or fear. The question you need to ask yourself isn't whether you're ready for this deployment. The question is whether you're ready for the person you're going to become because of it. As I boarded the transport plane at Fort Bragg, bound for Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan, I realized that Major Chen was right. I was leaving as First Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a promising young officer with potential. I had no idea who I'd be when I came back. But I knew that whoever that person was, she'd have earned the right to be taken seriously in ways my family couldn't even imagine. The plane lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness, carrying me toward a war zone where the games would finally end and the real work would begin. The dust hit you first in Afghanistan. Not just the physical grit that coated everything from your uniform to your coffee cup, but the psychological weight of knowing that every grain had been kicked up by decades of conflict. Bagram Airfield sprawled across the desert like a small American city dropped into hostile territory, complete with its own Pizza Hut, green bean coffee, and the constant thunder of helicopters ferrying supplies and personnel to forward operating bases scattered across the country. My home for the next 15 months was Forward Operating Base Shank in Logar Province, a collection of concrete barriers, prefabricated buildings, and guard towers that housed about 800 American and coalition forces. Shank sat in a valley surrounded by mountains that could hide enemy fighters, smuggling routes, and improvised explosive devices with equal efficiency. It was the kind of place where intelligence wasn't just important, it was the difference between soldiers going home alive or in flag-draped coffins. Captain Lisa Park, my new commanding officer, was a no-nonsense intelligence professional who'd already completed 2 deployments in Iraq. She had the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much, and the sharp focus of someone who refused to let experience make her careless. During my first briefing, she laid out the reality of our mission with brutal clarity. "Lieutenant Mitchell, this isn't Fort Bragg training exercises," she said, pointing to a map of Logar Province dotted with red pins marking recent attacks. "Every piece of intelligence we collect, every analysis we provide, every briefing we give, has one purpose: keeping our people alive while they complete their missions. The enemy doesn't take weekends off, doesn't follow Geneva Convention rules, and doesn't distinguish between combatants and civilians when it suits their purposes." She gestured toward a stack of incident reports on her desk. "Last month, we lost 3 soldiers to an IED because someone missed a pattern in insurgent movement. 2 weeks ago, a patrol walked into an ambush because our human intelligence was 12 hours out of date. These aren't statistics, Mitchell. These are rangers, infantrymen, medics, kids from Ohio and Texas and California who trusted us to keep them informed about what they're walking into." The weight of that responsibility hit me like a physical blow. Back at Fort Bragg, failed intelligence meant a poor grade on an exercise evaluation. Here it meant Gold Star families and memorial services. My first major operation came 3 weeks into my deployment. Intelligence sources had identified a suspected Taliban commander operating in a village about 15 kilometers south of our base. The mission was straightforward: capture or kill the target, gather any intelligence materials from his compound, and extract without civilian casualties. My job was to coordinate real-time intelligence feeds during the operation, providing updates on enemy positions, escape routes, and potential threats. The operation launched at 0200 hours with a combined force of Rangers and Special Operations personnel. I sat in the Tactical Operations Center, surrounded by screens showing drone feeds, radio communications, and digital maps updated in real time. For the first hour, everything proceeded according to plan. The assault team moved through the village without detection, reached the target compound, and began their breach. Then everything went wrong simultaneously. The target wasn't there. Instead, the compound was rigged with explosives that detonated as soon as the first soldiers entered. The blast wounded 3 Rangers and triggered a complex ambush from multiple directions. Within minutes, our forces were pinned down by small arms fire and rocket-propelled grenades, while enemy reinforcements moved to cut off their escape routes. "Phoenix Base, this is Ranger 6, the voice of Staff Sergeant Mike Thompson crackled through the radio, barely audible over gunfire. "We're taking heavy contact from 3 directions. Need immediate support and evacuation for wounded. Over. Captain Park turned to me, her face grim. Mitchell, I need options. What are you seeing on the feeds? I stared at the screens, processing multiple information streams simultaneously. Drone footage showed muzzle flashes from enemy positions. Radio intercepts revealed Taliban fighters coordinating their attack. Thermal imaging detected movement patterns that suggested a larger force than we'd anticipated. But buried in all that data, I spotted something else, a pattern that didn't fit. Captain, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, the enemy positions aren't random. They're herding our forces toward the eastern exit route. I think there's a secondary ambush waiting. Based on what? Vehicle movement patterns from yesterday's surveillance. 3 pickup trucks positioned along the eastern road that weren't there before. Radio chatter mentioning, quote, the second gift in Pashto. And look at this thermal imaging, I pointed to the screen. Heat signatures in buildings along the eastern route that should be empty at this hour. Captain Park studied the intelligence for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, while Rangers continued taking fire in the village. Finally, she keyed her radio. Ranger 6, Phoenix Base. Recommend you avoid eastern extraction route. Intelligence indicates secondary ambush position. Suggest northwest route through the orchard. Over. Phoenix Base, roger. Moving to alternate extraction route. The next hour was the longest of my life. I watched through drone cameras as wounded Rangers were carried through an orchard, while Taliban fighters tried to reposition for another attack. I coordinated close air support from Apache helicopters, provided real-time updates on enemy movements, and helped guide medical evacuation helicopters to the least dangerous landing zone. When the last helicopter lifted off with our wounded, carrying all our personnel safely back to base, I finally allowed myself to breathe. 3 Rangers had been wounded, but all were alive. The mission hadn't achieved its primary objective. The Taliban commander had escaped, but it could have been catastrophically worse. Staff Sergeant Thompson found me in the mess hall the next morning, his left arm in a sling from shrapnel wounds. He was a tough kid from Montana, barely 24 years old, with the kind of easy smile that made you forget he was trained to kill people with his bare hands. Lieutenant, he said, sitting down across from me with his breakfast tray. Heard you're the one who spotted that secondary ambush. I nodded, suddenly feeling awkward about taking credit for doing my job. Well, he continued, my boys and I just wanted you to know that analysis probably saved our lives. We were heading straight for that eastern route until you called it in. He extended his good hand. Thanks for keeping us alive, ma'am. As I shook his hand, I realized something had fundamentally changed in how I viewed my role. This wasn't about proving myself to skeptical family members or advancing my career. This was about young soldiers like Mike Thompson making it home to their families. Everything else was just noise. Over the following months, I threw myself into the intelligence mission with an intensity that surprised even Captain Park. I studied enemy patterns, learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished normal village activity from insurgent preparation, and developed relationships with local sources who could provide information that saved lives. I memorized the faces and names of every soldier who went on patrol, because when you're responsible for their safety, they stop being abstract personnel and become individuals with families waiting for them back home. The breakthrough that would define my deployment came during my 8th month at FOB Shank. I'd been tracking movement patterns in the region for weeks, noticing subtle changes in civilian behavior, vehicle traffic, and communication intercepts that suggested something significant was being planned. The intelligence pointed to a major attack, but the specifics remained maddeningly elusive. Working 18-hour days, I cross-referenced hundreds of pieces of information. Surveillance reports, intercepted communications, human intelligence from local sources, and analysis of improvised explosive device components recovered from previous attacks. Slowly, a picture emerged of a sophisticated operation targeting a coalition convoy route that carried supplies to multiple forward operating bases. The attack plan was elegant in its simplicity. A series of coordinated IED strikes along a 12-kilometer stretch of road, timed to coincide with the largest supply convoy of the month. If successful, it would disrupt operations across the region and likely kill dozens of coalition soldiers. But I'd identified the pattern 2 days before the planned attack. My briefing to the regimental commander was the most important presentation of my military career to that point. Colonel Patricia Hayes was a career infantry officer who'd commanded battalions in Iraq and Afghanistan. and she had little patience for intelligence assessments that weren't actionable. "Lieutenant Mitchell," she said, studying the analysis I'd prepared, "you're asking me to reroute 3 days' worth of supply convoys based on pattern analysis and communication intercepts. That's going to cost us significant time and resources. How confident are you in this assessment?" I thought about Staff Sergeant Thompson and his Rangers, about the hundreds of soldiers who depended on those supply convoys, about the families who would receive folded flags if my analysis was wrong, and I stayed silent. "Colonel, I'm confident enough to stake my career on it." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, Lieutenant, we'll reroute the convoys. If you're wrong, we'll discuss your future in military intelligence. If you're right..." She paused. "If you're right, a lot of soldiers will owe you their lives." The planned convoy route was avoided. 3 days later, explosive ordnance disposal teams found and disabled 17 improvised explosive devices along the original path, including 2 massive truck bombs that would have destroyed entire convoys. The intelligence assessment had been perfect. Colonel Hayes called me into her office the day after the IEDs were discovered. "Lieutenant Mitchell," she said, "in 23 years of military service, I've rarely seen intelligence work this thorough or this accurate. You just prevented what could have been the deadliest attack on coalition forces in this province all year." But the real validation came from the soldiers themselves. Walking through the base that evening, I was stopped repeatedly by infantrymen, mechanics, medics, and support personnel who'd heard about the prevented attack. These weren't elaborate thank you speeches, just quiet nods, handshakes, and simple words like, "Good work, Lieutenant," or "Appreciate you watching out for us." That night, I called home for the first time in 3 weeks. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the mixture of relief and worry that had characterized every conversation since my deployment began. "Sarah!" "Oh, honey, we've been so worried. Are you safe? Are you eating enough? When are you coming home?" I wanted to tell her about the convoy attack, about the lives saved, about the weight of responsibility that had transformed me from a promising young officer into someone who'd proven herself under the most demanding circumstances possible. Instead, I said what I always said. "I'm fine, Mom, just doing my job." "Well, your job is terrifying," she replied. "Kevin says you should be thinking about getting out when your commitment is up. He could help you find something safe in the private sector." Safe in the private sector. As if anything could be more important than what I was doing. As if preventing terrorist attacks and saving soldiers' lives was somehow less valuable than whatever Kevin was selling to corporate clients back in Chicago. But I didn't argue. I just listened to her talk about family news, neighborhood gossip, and Kevin's latest promotion, all delivered with the undertone that my real life was waiting for me back in the civilian world. She had no idea that my real life was right here, in a forward operating base in Afghanistan, where my decisions mattered more than anything I'd ever done before. When I hung up the phone, I realized that the distance between my family and me had grown beyond geography. They were living in a world where success was measured in salary increases and suburban comfort. I was living in a world where success was measured in lives saved and missions accomplished. And I was just getting started. Returning from Afghanistan was like stepping through a portal into an alternate reality where the most important events of the past 15 months had never happened. The plane touched down at Fort Bragg on a humid August morning, and within hours I was surrounded by the familiar rhythms of garrison life, regular chow hall hours, predictable training schedules, and the luxury of sleeping through the night without wondering if incoming mortars would wake you before dawn. But I wasn't the same person who'd left. The woman who deployed as a first lieutenant with potential had returned as a captain with proven combat experience, carrying commendations that most officers never see in entire careers. My efficiency report from Afghanistan read like something from a movie. Exceptionally gifted intelligence officer whose analytical work prevented multiple attacks and saved countless lives. Recommend for immediate advancement and consideration for strategic level assignments. Colonel Hayes had written a personal recommendation that accompanied my promotion packet. Captain Mitchell possesses the rare combination of analytical brilliance and battlefield judgment that distinguishes truly exceptional officers. Her performance in combat exceeded that of majors with twice her experience. She is ready for significantly increased responsibility. The Army agreed. Within 2 months of my return, I was reassigned to the Pentagon as a strategic intelligence analyst in the Joint Chiefs of Staff Intelligence Directorate. At 27 years old, I was briefing generals, admirals, and occasionally the Secretary of Defense himself on threats to American interests worldwide. My security clearance gave me access to information that maybe 1,000 people in the entire government were authorized to see. My first day at the Pentagon was surreal. The building itself was a monument to American military power, its corridors lined with portraits of generals and admirals who'd shaped history through their decisions. My office was modest, a small space in the intelligence section, but the work was anything but small. I was responsible for analyzing threats in the Middle East and South Asia, synthesizing intelligence from CIA, NSA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and military sources into assessments that influenced national security policy. My supervisor was Colonel Thomas Wright, a career intelligence officer who'd spent most of his 22-year career in assignments that never appeared in official biographies. He was thin, intense, and had the peculiar ability to remember conversations from years earlier with photographic precision. "Captain Mitchell," he said during my first briefing, "your work in Afghanistan has earned you a seat at a very exclusive table. The intelligence assessments you'll be producing here don't just inform military operations. They shape presidential decision-making. When you write that a particular threat requires immediate attention, people with 4 stars on their shoulders take notice." He pulled out a classified folder marked with security classifications I'd only heard mentioned in whispers. "Your first assignment is analyzing Iranian military movements near the Strait of Hormuz. Satellite imagery suggests they're positioning anti-ship missiles in ways that could threaten commercial shipping. I need an assessment of their capabilities, intentions, and recommended response options within 72 hours. 72 hours to analyze a potential threat that could trigger international conflict. No pressure at all." The next 3 days were a blur of classified briefings, satellite imagery analysis, and meetings with intelligence analysts from other agencies. I worked 18-hour days, cross-referencing Iranian military doctrine with intercepted communications, analyzing historical patterns of Iranian behavior during international crises, and developing multiple scenarios for how the situation might evolve. My final briefing was delivered to a room containing 2 generals, an admiral, and deputy directors from 3 intelligence agencies. For 45 minutes I presented my analysis. The Iranian movements were likely defensive preparations in response to increased American naval presence in the region, not offensive positioning for an attack on commercial shipping. I recommended continued monitoring but argued against immediate military response that could escalate tensions unnecessarily. General Michael Harrison, the deputy director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, asked the question that would define my Pentagon experience. "Captain, you're recommending we essentially do nothing based on your assessment that this is defensive positioning. What if you're wrong? What if these missiles are used to attack civilian ships?" I thought about the convoy attack I'd prevented in Afghanistan, about the weight of decisions that could cost lives. "Sir, intelligence assessment isn't about certainty, it's about probability based on available evidence. Given Iranian military doctrine, historical behavior patterns, and current regional dynamics, I assess a less than 15% probability that these missile positions are intended for offensive operations against civilian shipping. However, I recommend continued monitoring and development of contingency plans should the situation change." 3 weeks later, Iranian forces withdrew the missile batteries without incident, exactly as my assessment had predicted. It was my first success at the strategic level, but it wouldn't be my last. Over the following 2 years at the Pentagon, I briefed the Secretary of Defense on North Korean missile development, provided threat assessments for special operations missions in 3 different countries, and helped develop intelligence requirements for contingency planning in the South China Sea. My work was classified at levels that meant I couldn't even acknowledge its existence to anyone without proper clearance, let alone discuss it with family members, which made my annual Christmas visit home particularly frustrating. I walked into my parents' house in Denver carrying 2 years of strategic-level experience that had shaped American foreign policy, and was immediately greeted by my mother's familiar refrain, "Sarah, you look so thin. Are they feeding you enough in Washington? And you're getting wrinkles around your eyes? All that stress isn't good for you." The Christmas dinner conversation followed its predictable pattern. Kevin dominated discussion with updates about his latest promotion to senior vice president, his new house in an exclusive suburb, and his plans to buy a vacation home in Aspen. My cousin Bradley announced his engagement to a pharmaceutical sales representative he'd met at a medical conference. Everyone celebrated with champagne toasts and animated discussions about wedding planning. When the conversation eventually turned to me, the tone shifted to polite curiosity mixed with underlying concern. "So Sarah," my Aunt Susan asked, "are you still doing that intelligence work in Washington? That must be interesting." Interesting. I was helping prevent international conflicts, analyzing threats that could destabilize entire regions, and providing intelligence that protected American soldiers deployed around the world. But to my family, it was interesting in the way that stamp collecting might be interesting, a harmless hobby that kept me occupied. "It's challenging work," I said carefully, knowing that security classifications prevented me from explaining what I actually did. "I'm sure it is, dear," my mother said with that sympathetic smile I'd learned to hate. "But don't you think it's time to consider transitioning to the private sector? Kevin's company hires former military officers all the time. You could make so much more money, and you wouldn't have to worry about being deployed to dangerous places again." The private sector, where Kevin analyzed market trends, while I analyzed threats to national security. Where corporate executives made decisions about quarterly profits, while I helped make decisions about war and peace. But in my family's worldview, his work was important because it paid well, while mine was just an extended detour from real success. The most painful moment came when my father pulled me aside after dinner. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine concern, "your mother and I have been talking. You're 30 years old now. Don't you want to settle down, get married, have children? This military career is preventing you from having a normal life." Normal life. As if briefing the Secretary of Defense was abnormal. As if helping prevent international conflicts was somehow less valuable than Kevin's suburban existence. As if protecting American interests around the world was an obstacle to fulfillment rather than the most meaningful work I could imagine. But I couldn't explain any of that, because my actual responsibilities were classified. I couldn't tell them about the North Korean missile analysis that had influenced diplomatic negotiations, or the special operations intelligence that had prevented terrorist attacks, or the strategic assessments that appeared in the president's daily brief. Security classifications meant that my most significant achievements were invisible to the people whose approval I'd once craved. So I just smiled and said what I always said, "I'm happy with my choices, Dad. This work matters to me." He sighed, the kind of sound parents make when they're watching their children make decisions they can't understand. "I just worry that you're missing out on life while you're busy saving the world. Missing out on life while saving the world." The irony was perfect. He'd accidentally described exactly why my work mattered more than anything Kevin was doing in his corporate boardroom. The validation I couldn't get from family came from unexpected sources. During my 3rd year at the Pentagon, I received a personal note from General Patricia Hayes, my former commander in Afghanistan, who'd recently been promoted to Deputy Commanding General of Army Special Operations. "Captain Mitchell," she wrote, "word of your exceptional work at the Pentagon has reached those of us who remember your outstanding performance in combat. You continue to exceed expectations at every level. The Army needs more officers like you in positions of strategic responsibility." More significantly, I was selected for the Army's Elite Command and General Staff College, a 1-year program at Fort Leavenworth that was essentially graduate school for future generals. The selection rate was brutal. Maybe 10% of eligible officers were chosen, and only those identified as having potential for senior command positions were even considered. Colonel Wright delivered the news personally. "Captain Mitchell," he said, "this selection is significant. Staff College is where the Army invests in officers it believes will eventually wear stars on their shoulders. You've been identified as having strategic leadership potential at the highest levels." I called home to share the news, expecting at least recognition that this was a significant achievement. Instead, my mother's first response was, "Kansas? Oh, Sarah, that sounds so far away and lonely. Are you sure you want to spend a year in the middle of nowhere when you could be looking for a nice job in a city where you might meet someone? Meeting someone. As if my career was just a placeholder until the right man came along to rescue me from my misguided ambitions. As if Command and General Staff College, where future generals were educated, was less important than dating prospects in major metropolitan areas. Kevin's reaction was more direct. Sarah, I don't understand why you keep taking these military assignments that move you farther away from normal life. At some point, you need to think about your future outside the army. You can't be a soldier forever. Can't be a soldier forever. He had no idea that I wasn't planning to be a soldier forever. I was planning to be a general. But explaining that to someone who saw military service as temporary employment was like explaining advanced mathematics to someone who'd never learned to count. As I packed my belongings for Fort Leavenworth, I realized that my family's inability to understand my achievements had taught me something valuable about leadership. Sometimes the most important work happens in shadows, protected by security classifications and institutional secrecy. Sometimes the people who shape history are invisible to those who benefit from their decisions. But invisibility didn't diminish the importance of the work. If anything, it made it more significant. I wasn't seeking recognition or approval anymore. I was seeking the knowledge and experience that would prepare me for responsibilities my family couldn't even imagine. Command and General Staff College would be another step toward those responsibilities. And after that, there would be others, each one taking me further from their understanding and closer to the truth I'd discovered in Afghanistan. Some work is too important to abandon, just because other people can't see its value. The distance between my family and me had grown beyond geography or understanding. It had become the distance between those who serve and those who are served, between those who sacrifice for principles and those who prioritize comfort. It was a distance I'd stopped trying to bridge, because I'd finally learned that some gaps can't be closed with explanations. They can only be demonstrated through results. Fort Leavenworth, Kansas sits on bluffs overlooking the Missouri River, like a scholarly fortress, where America's future military leaders come to sharpen their minds for the complexities of modern warfare. The Command and General Staff College wasn't just another military school. It was the intellectual proving ground where captains and majors learned to think like colonels and generals, where tactical expertise evolved into strategic vision. My classmates represented the cream of the officer corps. Rhodes Scholars who'd commanded companies in Iraq, West Point graduates who'd led special operations teams in Syria, and brilliant military minds from every branch of service. These weren't just soldiers. They were the officers the military had identified as having potential to wear stars on their shoulders someday. The curriculum was unlike anything I'd experienced, even at West Point. We studied military history not just to understand what happened, but to analyze decision-making under pressure. We examined failed campaigns to understand how brilliant generals could make catastrophic mistakes. We war-gamed scenarios involving nuclear weapons, cyber warfare, and conflicts that could reshape global power structures. My faculty advisor was Colonel Rebecca Santos, a former battalion commander who'd earned a Purple Heart in Afghanistan and a PhD in international relations from Harvard. She had the rare combination of combat credibility and academic brilliance that made her opinions impossible to dismiss. "Major Mitchell," she said during our first one-on-one meeting, "I'd been promoted to major before arriving at Leavenworth. Your Pentagon experience gives you a perspective that most of your classmates lack. You've seen how strategic intelligence shapes policy at the highest levels. But command is different. Intelligence informs decisions. Command requires making them, often with incomplete information and lives hanging in the balance." She pulled out my file, which had grown substantially thicker since my West Point graduation. "Your efficiency reports are exceptional. Your combat performance in Afghanistan was outstanding. Your strategic work at the Pentagon has been noted at the highest levels. But the question the Army is asking now is whether you can transition from being an exceptional staff officer to being an exceptional commander." The test came during our capstone exercise in the spring semester, a simulated command scenario where each student was given responsibility for a fictional brigade-sized unit facing a complex international crisis. My scenario involved commanding a combined arms brigade during a hypothetical peacekeeping mission in Eastern Europe, where ethnic tensions threatened to explode into full-scale civil war. The simulation lasted 2 weeks and included everything from logistical challenges to diplomatic negotiations. I had to coordinate with fictional UN officials, manage relationships with local government leaders, played by faculty members, and make real-time decisions as the situation evolved unpredictably. Most critically, I had to balance military objectives with political constraints while keeping my fictional soldiers alive. The breakthrough moment came on day 9 of the exercise. My brigade was positioned between two ethnic factions that had been fighting for generations, tasked with maintaining a ceasefire that grew more fragile by the hour. Intelligence reports indicated that extremists on both sides were planning attacks designed to reignite the conflict, but I couldn't determine which faction would strike first or what form the attack would take. Traditional military doctrine suggested positioning forces to respond to attacks rather than prevent them, a reactive stance that would minimize risk to my soldiers but potentially allow civilian casualties that could destabilize the entire region. However, my experience in Afghanistan had taught me that sometimes preventing conflict requires taking calculated risks. I made a decision that violated conventional peacekeeping doctrine. I deployed my forces aggressively, positioning them directly between the potential combatants rather than in defensive positions. When both factions began mobilizing for attacks, my soldiers were already in place to intercept them. The aggressive positioning prevented the attacks but put my brigade at significantly greater risk. The faculty observers were divided. Some criticized my decision as unnecessarily risky. Others praised it as innovative thinking that achieved the mission objective while minimizing overall casualties. The debate continued for hours after the exercise concluded, with colonels and lieutenant colonels arguing about whether my approach represented brilliant leadership or dangerous recklessness. Colonel Santos settled the argument during the final debrief. Major Mitchell's decision demonstrates exactly the kind of thinking we need from future general officers, she announced to the assembled faculty and students. She understood that her mission wasn't just to keep her soldiers safe, it was to maintain peace in the region. She accepted tactical risk to achieve strategic success. That's the essence of senior leadership. But the real validation came from my classmates. Major David Kim, a decorated infantry officer who'd commanded a company during the heaviest fighting in Iraq, approached me after the debrief with a serious expression. "Mitchell," he said, "I've been in combat with a lot of officers over the years. Some are tactically brilliant but can't see the big picture. Others understand strategy, but struggle with implementation. What you did in that exercise, balancing tactical risk with strategic objectives while maintaining ethical standards, that's general-level thinking. You're going to wear stars someday." The prediction proved prophetic faster than anyone expected. During my final month at Leavenworth, I received notification that I'd been selected for early promotion to lieutenant colonel and assignment as executive officer of the 75th Ranger Regiment, one of the Army's most elite units. The assignment was a clear signal that the Army saw me as a future commander of Special Operations Forces. More significantly, the promotion came with a personal note from General Patricia Hayes, who'd recently been promoted to lieutenant general and now served as Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence. "Sarah," she wrote, using my first name for the first time in our professional relationship, "your selection for the Ranger Regiment represents the Army's confidence in your potential for strategic command. This assignment will test every skill you've developed and prepare you for responsibilities that few officers ever experience. You've earned this opportunity through exceptional performance at every level." I called home to share the news, knowing by then not to expect enthusiasm but hoping for at least acknowledgement of the significance. My mother answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the familiar mixture of love and bewilderment that characterized all our conversations about my career. "Lieutenant Colonel?" she repeated, as if testing the words. "That sounds very important, sweetheart. But doesn't that mean more responsibility? More stress? Sarah, you're 34 years old. When are you going to think about settling down?" Settling down. I was about to become the second highest ranking officer in one of America's most elite military units, responsible for operations that would never appear in newspapers but could change the course of international events. But to my mother, this was still just an obstacle to the suburban life she'd envisioned for me. Kevin's response was more direct and more painful. "Sarah, I don't understand what you're trying to prove. You've already served your country. You've proven you can succeed in the military. But look at the bigger picture. You're giving up your prime earning years for government salary. My bonus last year was more than you make in 2 years. At some point, you need to think about financial security. Financial security. While Kevin worried about stock options and retirement accounts, I was preparing to lead operations that protected American interests in the most dangerous corners of the world. While he analyzed market trends, I would be analyzing threats to national security. But in his worldview, success was measured in dollars, not in the lives saved or missions accomplished. The most revealing conversation came during my last visit home before reporting to the Ranger Regiment. My father sat me down in his study, the same room where he'd graded papers during my childhood, and delivered what was clearly a prepared speech. "Sarah," he began, his voice carrying the weight of genuine concern. "Your mother and I are proud of what you've accomplished. We really are. But we're also worried about you. You're brilliant, you're capable, and you could succeed at anything you choose to do. We just don't understand why you're choosing something so difficult." Difficult. As if difficulty was a reason to avoid meaningful work, rather than a sign that the work was worth doing. "Dad," I said, "I'm not choosing difficulty for its own sake. I'm choosing work that matters." The Ranger Regiment conducts operations that most people will never hear about, but they protect American lives and interests around the world. That's not just a job. It's a calling. He sighed, the sound of a parent who'd given up trying to understand, but hadn't given up caring. "I suppose I just wish your calling involved less personal risk and more personal happiness. You could have such a normal, comfortable life if you wanted it." Normal and comfortable. The words that had defined every conversation about my career since high school. My family saw comfort as the goal and danger as something to be avoided. I saw purpose as the goal and risk as the price of achieving something meaningful. As I packed my belongings for Fort Benning, Georgia, where the Ranger Regiment was headquartered, I reflected on how far I'd traveled from that 18-year-old who'd left for West Point amid family concerns about her unconventional choices. Every promotion, every assignment, every commendation had taken me further from their understanding, but closer to my own sense of purpose. The Ranger Regiment would be my final test before senior command positions became possible. As executive officer, I would be second in command of a unit that conducted the military's most sensitive operations, from counterterrorism missions to strategic reconnaissance in denied territories. It was exactly the kind of assignment that prepared officers for general rank, if they could handle the pressure. 3 days before leaving for Fort Benning, I received an unexpected phone call from General Michael Harrison, whom I'd briefed at the Pentagon about Iranian missile threats years earlier. He'd been promoted to Deputy Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency and had been following my career progression. "Sarah," he said, "I wanted to personally congratulate you on your selection for the Ranger Regiment. It's an exceptional assignment for someone your age, and represents extraordinary confidence in your capabilities. But I also wanted to prepare you for what comes next. Sir, if you succeed as Executive Officer of the Rangers, and I believe you will, you'll be positioned for command of strategic-level units within a few years. Battalion command, then brigade command, then division command. Eventually, if you continue performing at this level, you'll be considered for general officer rank. That's a path very few officers travel, and it requires sacrifices that go beyond what you've already made." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "The question you need to ask yourself isn't whether you're ready for the Ranger Regiment. The question is whether you're ready for everything that comes after it." As I hung up the phone, I realized that General Harrison was right. The Ranger Regiment wasn't just another assignment. It was the gateway to a level of responsibility that would take me even further from my family's understanding. If I succeeded, I would eventually face choices that they couldn't even imagine, responsibilities that they could never comprehend. But I was ready for those choices, ready for those responsibilities. Somewhere along the path from that dismissed college freshman to a lieutenant colonel selected for elite command, I'd stopped needing their approval and started trusting my own judgment about what mattered. The stars on a general's shoulders weren't just rank insignia. They were symbols of responsibility for American soldiers' lives, for national security decisions, for leadership in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. If that path led me further from my family's suburban definition of success, so be it. Pump the safety. Some destinations are worth the distance traveled to reach them. Fort Benning, Georgia, was where the Army forged its most elite warriors, and the 75th Ranger Regiment represented the absolute pinnacle of that tradition. Walking through the gates for the first time as the new executive officer, I felt the weight of history and expectation that came with joining a unit whose motto was "Rangers Lead the Way." This wasn't just another assignment. It was joining a brotherhood that had earned its reputation in every American conflict since World War II. Colonel Marcus Thompson, the regiment commander, was a legend in special operations circles. He'd commanded Ranger units in Iraq, Afghanistan, and places that didn't officially exist on any mission reports. When he welcomed me to the regiment, his words carried the weight of someone who'd seen the best and worst that warfare could offer. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell," he said in his office, lined with unit photographs spanning decades of operations. "You're joining a regiment that conducts missions others can't or won't attempt. We operate in the shadows, often without recognition, always without margin for error. Your job as executive officer isn't just to manage operations, it's to ensure that every Ranger who deploys comes home, and that every mission achieves its objectives without compromising American interests." He gestured toward a map of the world, dotted with pins marking current operations. "We have Rangers deployed in 7 countries right now, conducting operations that range from direct action against high-value targets to strategic reconnaissance in denied territories. The intelligence you developed at the Pentagon, the command principles you learned at Leavenworth, everything has prepared you for this moment when theoretical knowledge becomes life-and-death responsibility. My first major test came 3 months into the assignment. Intelligence agencies had identified a terrorist network operating from a compound in Syria, planning attacks against American targets in Europe. The mission required surgical precision: neutralize the threat, gather intelligence materials, and extract without creating an international incident that could destabilize the region. As executive officer, I was responsible for mission planning, coordination with intelligence agencies, and ensuring that every aspect of the operation proceeded flawlessly. The mission involved 2 Ranger companies, special operations aviation assets, and real-time intelligence support from multiple agencies. Failure wasn't just mission failure. It could mean dead Rangers and international consequences that reached the highest levels of government. The planning phase consumed 2 weeks of 18-hour days. Every detail had to be perfect: insertion routes, exfiltration procedures, contingency plans for mission compromise, coordination with drone surveillance, and backup plans for every conceivable scenario. I briefed and rebriefed the operation until every Ranger could execute their role under the most adverse conditions. Colonel Thompson observed my planning briefings with the intensity of someone who'd commanded too many operations where small mistakes cost lives. After the final rehearsal, he pulled me aside for a conversation that would define my understanding of command responsibility. "Sarah," he said, using my first name in the privacy of his office, "you've planned this operation with exceptional attention to detail. Your coordination with supporting agencies has been flawless. Your contingency planning covers scenarios that most officers wouldn't even consider. But I need to ask you a question that has nothing to do with tactical proficiency." He paused, studying my face with the intensity of someone evaluating character under pressure. "When those Rangers cross the line of departure tomorrow night, you'll be responsible for decisions that determine whether they come home alive. Are you prepared for that weight? Not the theoretical weight you studied at Leavenworth, but the actual weight of knowing that your choices determine whether mothers receive folded flags instead of phone calls." I thought about Staff Sergeant Thompson from Afghanistan, about all the soldiers whose lives had depended on my intelligence analysis, about the progression from theoretical exercises to real-world consequences that had defined my entire military career. "Sir," I replied, "I've carried that weight since Afghanistan. Every intelligence assessment, every briefing, every decision has been made with the understanding that real lives hang in the balance. I'm not just prepared for that responsibility, I've proven I can handle it." He nodded, satisfied. "Then let's bring our Rangers home." The operation launched at 0200 hours on a moonless night. I monitored the mission from the Tactical Operations Center, coordinating real-time intelligence feeds, managing communication with higher headquarters, and prepared to authorize emergency support if the situation deteriorated. For 4 hours, I watched through drone cameras as Rangers moved through hostile territory toward their objective. Everything proceeded according to plan until the Rangers reached the target compound. Instead of the expected terrorist cell, they found a much larger operation, a training facility with nearly 50 fighters and enough weapons to supply a small army. The intelligence had been accurate but incomplete. What was supposed to be a surgical strike against a planning cell had become a major engagement against a terrorist training complex. Ranger Base. This is Ranger 6, the voice of Captain Lisa Park crackled through encrypted communications. Target is significantly larger than briefed. We're taking heavy contact and need immediate support. How copy? Colonel Thompson looked at me. This was my operation, my planning, my responsibility. The Rangers were engaged in a firefight that exceeded mission parameters, but they were also in position to eliminate a terrorist threat much larger than anyone had anticipated. I had seconds to make a decision that would determine the mission outcome. Ranger 6, this is Ranger Base, I responded. You are authorized to expand mission scope. Additional close air support is en route. Rules of engagement remain in effect. Execute mission and neutralize all threats. The next 2 hours were the longest of my military career. I coordinated air support from multiple platforms, managed logistics for extended operations, and maintained communication with intelligence agencies providing real-time updates. Through drone feeds, I watched Rangers assault a complex that could have trained hundreds of terrorists for attacks against American targets. When the last Ranger helicopter lifted off from the compound, we had achieved something unprecedented. Neutralization of a major terrorist training facility, capture of high-value targets who provided intelligence about planned attacks, and recovery of documents that prevented multiple terrorist operations across Europe. Most importantly, all Rangers returned safely despite the expanded mission scope. The mission debrief revealed the true significance of what had been accomplished. The terrorist training facility had been preparing operatives for coordinated attacks during the upcoming Olympics in Paris. The intelligence materials recovered prevented what could have been the deadliest terrorist attack in European history. My decision to expand mission scope instead of extracting when the situation changed had literally saved thousands of lives. General Patricia Hayes, now serving as Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, flew to Fort Benning personally to debrief the mission. Her assessment was unequivocal. This operation represents exactly the kind of adaptive leadership the Army needs at senior levels. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell demonstrated the judgment to modify mission parameters in real time while maintaining focus on strategic objectives. This is general officer level decision-making. But the real validation came from the Rangers themselves. Captain Park, the company commander who'd led the assault, found me in the mess hall the day after the mission. She was a tough professional with multiple combat deployments, not given to emotional displays or excessive praise. "Ma'am," she said, sitting down across from me with her coffee, "I've served under a lot of officers over the years. Most of them make decisions based on career safety. They follow procedures to protect themselves rather than accomplish the mission. What you did during that operation, authorizing mission expansion when things got complicated, that took real courage. You put mission success ahead of personal risk, and you trusted us to execute. That's the kind of leadership that makes soldiers willing to follow officers into impossible situations." She paused, studying my face. "You're going to be a general someday, aren't you?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was the first time someone had stated what I'd been working toward for years. "I hope so," I replied honestly. "Good," she said. "The Army needs more general officers who understand what it's like to make hard decisions when lives are on the line. Most flag officers have never had to authorize operations where their choices determine whether soldiers come home alive. You have, and it shows." 6 months later, I received notification that would change the trajectory of my career, selection for colonel, and command of the 3rd Special Forces Group. It was an assignment that would place me in command of Green Beret units conducting operations worldwide, responsible for strategic missions that shaped American foreign policy in regions most people couldn't locate on a map. More significantly, the assignment came with a personal meeting with General Michael Harrison, who who'd been promoted to director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He flew to Fort Benning specifically to discuss my career progression, a level of attention that indicated something significant was happening behind the scenes. "Colonel Mitchell," he said in Colonel Thompson's office, "your performance as executive officer of the Rangers has exceeded all expectations. The Syrian operation you planned and executed has been studied as a model of adaptive leadership under pressure. You've demonstrated every quality the Army seeks in senior commanders: tactical expertise, strategic thinking, decision-making under pressure, and the moral courage to accept responsibility for difficult choices." He pulled out a classified document, marked with security classifications I recognized from my Pentagon days. "I'm here to discuss your next phase of career development. Command of the 3rd Special Forces Group is a colonel-level assignment, but it's also a stepping stone to brigade-level command and eventual consideration for general officer rank." The conversation that followed was unlike any I'd experienced in 15 years of military service. General Harrison outlined a career path that would take me through increasingly responsible command positions: Special Forces Group Commander, then Joint Task Force Commander, then Division Commander, ultimately leading to consideration for general officer rank within the next 5 to 7 years. "Sarah," he said, "the Army has been watching your progression for years. Your combination of intelligence expertise, combat experience, and command capability represents exactly what we need in future general officers. But I need to be direct about what this path requires." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "General officers don't just command units. They shape national security policy. They brief presidents, influence international relations, and make decisions that affect global stability. The responsibilities you've handled so far, significant as they are, represent preparation for leadership roles that most people can't even imagine." As I absorbed the implications of his words, I realized that my journey from dismissed college graduate to potential general officer was nearing its culmination. Every assignment, every challenge, every moment of doubt had been preparation for responsibilities that would take me further from my family's understanding than I'd ever been. But it would also place me in positions where I could shape American military policy, protect soldiers' lives on a global scale, and serve my country at the highest possible level. The cost of that service, the distance from family approval, the weight of life and death decisions, the isolation that came with classified responsibilities, was a price I'd been preparing to pay for years. The stars on a general's shoulders weren't just rank insignia, they were symbols of responsibility for decisions that shaped history, for leadership in the most challenging circumstances, for service that most people would never understand but millions would benefit from. I was ready for those stars. The only question was whether my family would ever understand what they represented. Standing in that reunion ballroom, champagne glass in hand, I watched Marcus Wellington approach with the same condescending smile he'd worn 20 years earlier when we were college roommates. The years had been kind to him. Expensive suit, confident posture, the easy arrogance of someone who'd never questioned whether his definition of success was the only one that mattered. The reunion committee had done their usual job of turning our old university ballroom into a shrine to achievement. Wall displays showcased the success stories of our graduating class: tech executives, investment bankers, surgeons, corporate lawyers. All the careers that impressed people at cocktail parties. All the paths that led to suburban mansions and country club memberships. My own career was notably absent from the displays. Not because it wasn't successful, but because security classifications meant that most of my achievements over the past 2 decades couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The operations I'd planned, the lives I'd saved, the threats I'd neutralized, all of it was buried in classified files that would remain secret for decades. "Sarah, there you are!" Marcus's voice boomed across the room as he approached, his smile as calculated as ever. "We were just talking about career paths. You know, comparing notes on who's climbed the highest corporate ladders." He gestured toward the group. "Tech executives, investment bankers, surgeons, the usual suspects." Behind him, I could see our old classmates. Jennifer Chen, now a pharmaceutical executive. David Rodriguez, who'd built a consulting empire. Amanda Foster, who'd become a federal judge. All impressive careers by any measure, all worthy of respect and recognition. "And you?" Marcus continued, his tone shifting to something that sounded almost sympathetic. "You're still in the military, right? Same old Sarah, still playing soldier after all these years." "Still playing soldier," The words hung in the air like smoke from a decades-old fire that had never quite been extinguished. I felt my phone vibrate in my evening clutch, the message I'd been expecting all night. I pulled it out discreetly and glanced at the screen. Operation Nightfall mission parameters confirmed. Full deployment authorization granted. Signed, Joint Chiefs of Staff. I slipped the phone back into my purse and looked up at Marcus, my expression unchanged. Around me, the conversation continued with the familiar rhythm of successful people cataloging their achievements, stock options and IPOs, surgical innovations and legal victories, all measured in dollars earned and accolades received. Something like that, I said quietly, taking a sip of champagne as the room buzzed with the kind of laughter that comes from people who think they know everything about everyone. Jennifer Chen joined the conversation, her voice carrying the polite interest of someone making small talk about a hobby. Military service must be so structured. Do you miss having more freedom in your career choices? Freedom in career choices. As if leading special operations forces in 7 countries was somehow restrictive. As if briefing the President of the United States was less liberating than managing pharmaceutical sales territories. It has its rewards, I replied, watching as more classmates gathered around us, drawn by the familiar dynamic of successful people discussing the paths not taken. David Rodriguez jumped in with the confidence of someone who'd read exactly one article about military compensation. The pay structure must be challenging, though. I mean, what does a military officer make these days? It can't compete with private sector opportunities. The assumption was always the same, that compensation was the ultimate measure of value, that serving your country was somehow less important than serving shareholders. I thought about the soldiers whose lives I'd protected, the terrorist attacks I'd prevented, the international crises I'd helped resolve, all of it invisible to people who measured worth in quarterly earnings reports. The compensation is adequate, I said simply, not mentioning that my current salary as a newly promoted brigadier general exceeded what most of them had earned in their first decade of civilian careers. Brigadier general. The promotion had come through just 6 months earlier, making me one of the youngest general officers in the Army and placing me in command of a joint task force responsible for special operations across 3 geographic regions. The ceremony had been small, attended by family members who still didn't quite understand what they were witnessing, and colleagues who understood exactly how rare and significant the achievement was. Marcus seemed to sense an opportunity to demonstrate his superior understanding of career planning. Sarah, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but have you ever considered transitioning to the private sector? I mean, your leadership experience could be valuable in corporate settings. Defense contractors pay very well for former military officers. Former military officers. As if my career was already past tense. As if they were planning my exit strategy from a job they couldn't understand or respect. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that earlier that evening I'd received final confirmation of Operation Nightfall, a joint special operations mission that would shape American foreign policy in the Middle East for the next decade. The mission was classified at levels that meant fewer than 50 people in the entire government knew it existed. Success would prevent a regional conflict that could destabilize global energy markets and cost thousands of lives. Failure could trigger the kind of international crisis that ended careers and changed the course of history. But to Marcus and my classmates, I was just Sarah the soldier, still playing military dress-up 20 years after graduation. That's very thoughtful, I said, but I'm quite satisfied with my current position. Amanda Foster, the federal judge, smiled with the kind of professional sympathy reserved for people making obviously poor life choices. Sarah, we're all impressed by your dedication to service. Really, we are. But don't you ever want something more stable, something with better long-term financial prospects? Something more stable. I was responsible for operations that protected American interests across multiple continents, for decisions that influenced international relations, for leadership of forces that most people didn't know existed. But to Amanda, stability meant a predictable court schedule and a government pension. The conversation continued around me, with each classmate adding their perspective on my situation. The underlying message was consistent. Military service was noble but limited, appropriate for young people but not for long-term career building, respectable but ultimately a stepping stone to something more significant in the civilian world. I listened to their well-meaning advice with the patience that comes from 20 years of similar conversations with family, friends, and acquaintances who couldn't conceive that someone might choose service over salary, mission over money, responsibility over recognition. Then Marcus delivered the line that crystallized everything. "I just think you're selling yourself short, Sarah. With your intelligence and leadership abilities, you could be running a major corporation by now instead of taking orders from politicians. Taking orders from politicians." The irony was perfect. Just that morning, I'd briefed the Secretary of Defense on Operation Nightfall. Next week, I would brief the President himself on intelligence assessments that would influence his decisions about American military involvement in 3 different regions. Politicians didn't give me orders. They asked for my professional judgment on matters of national security. But Marcus's comment revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had defined every conversation about my career for 2 decades. In his worldview, military officers were employees who followed instructions from their civilian superiors. He couldn't conceive that senior military leaders were advisors and decision-makers who shaped the policies they implemented. I looked around the room at my successful classmates, each one accomplished in their field, each one deserving of respect for their achievements. They'd built impressive careers, accumulated wealth, earned recognition in their professions. But none of them had commanded soldiers in combat. None of them had made decisions that determined whether people lived or died. None of them had prevented terrorist attacks or shaped international relations or advised presidents on matters of war and peace. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying just enough authority to cut through the conversation, "I need to correct a misunderstanding." The group fell silent, perhaps sensing that something had shifted in the dynamic. "I don't take orders from politicians, Marcus. I advise them." As a brigadier general in the United States Army, I brief the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and occasionally the President himself on matters of national security. The silence deepened. Marcus's confident smile faltered. "For the past 6 months, I've commanded a joint task force responsible for special operations in multiple countries. The operations I plan and execute don't appear in newspapers because they're classified at levels that most government officials aren't authorized to know about them. Tonight, while we've been discussing career paths, I received final authorization for a mission that will prevent a regional conflict in the Middle East." Jennifer Chen's expression had shifted from polite interest to something approaching awe. "You're a general?" "Brigadier General," I confirmed. "And for the past 20 years, while you've all been building impressive civilian careers, I've been serving my country at increasingly senior levels of responsibility. I've commanded soldiers in combat, prevented terrorist attacks, and helped shape American foreign policy in ways that most people will never know about." David Rodriguez looked like he was trying to process information that didn't fit his understanding of military careers. "But you never mentioned. We had no idea. Security classifications prevent me from discussing most of my work," I explained. "The missions I've commanded, the operations I've planned, the threats I've neutralized, all of it remains classified for decades. But that doesn't make it less important or less challenging than anything you've accomplished in the civilian world." Marcus had gone completely pale. "Sarah, I had no idea. When you said you were still in the military, I thought..." "You thought I was still a junior officer playing soldier," I finished for him. "You thought military service was something people did temporarily before moving on to real careers. You thought my choice to serve was a limitation rather than an achievement." Amanda Foster spoke carefully, clearly recalibrating her entire understanding of our conversation. "Sarah, this is extraordinary. A general at our age is incredible. But why didn't you ever tell us?" "Because for 20 years, every conversation about my career has been dominated by assumptions that military service is less valuable than civilian success." Tonight, Marcus called it playing soldier. "My own family still asks when I'm going to get a quote, 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 quote. After 2 decades of being dismissed, I stopped trying to explain what I actually do. I looked around the group, seeing my classmates with new eyes. They were successful, accomplished people who'd achieved impressive things in their fields. But they'd also spent 20 years assuming that their definition of success was the only one that mattered, that their paths were inherently more valuable than mine. "The truth is," I continued, I've never regretted my choice to serve. Every promotion, every assignment, every challenge has been preparation for greater responsibility and more meaningful work. Tonight, while we're celebrating our careers, soldiers are deployed in dangerous places around the world, depending on decisions I've made to keep them safe. That's not a limitation. It's the most important work I can imagine. The room had grown quiet around us, other conversations pausing as people sensed something significant happening. Marcus struggled to find words that could bridge the gap between his assumptions and reality. "Sarah, I owe you an apology, we all do. I had no idea that military service could lead to this level of responsibility." "Most people don't," I replied. "But that's exactly the problem. Military service is seen as a detour from success rather than a path to it. Tonight you assumed I was selling myself short by staying in the Army. The reality is that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do." I finished my champagne and set the glass on a nearby table. "I need to go. I have a 0600 briefing tomorrow about Operation Nightfall, and there are soldiers depending on me to make the right decisions." As I walked toward the exit, I heard Jennifer Chen say quietly, "She's a general. Sarah Mitchell is a general." The weight of those words followed me out of the ballroom and into the cool evening air. For 20 years, I'd carried the burden of other people's misunderstanding, the weight of achievements that couldn't be shared, the isolation that came with serving at levels most people couldn't comprehend. But tonight, for the first time, I'd stopped trying to bridge the gap between their world and mine. I'd simply stated the truth. I was Brigadier General Sarah Mitchell, United States Army, and I'd earned every star on my shoulders through service, sacrifice, and decisions that shaped the world in ways they'd never understand. As I drove home through the quiet streets, I thought about tomorrow's briefing, about Operation Nightfall, about the soldiers whose lives would depend on my leadership in the months ahead. I thought about the path that had brought me from that dismissed college graduate to a general officer responsible for protecting American interests around the world. Most importantly, I thought about the 20-year-old version of myself, who'd chosen service over comfort, mission over money, responsibility over recognition. She'd made the right choice, even when everyone around her couldn't see it. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that take decades to reveal themselves. Sometimes the greatest success is the kind that can't be measured in dollars or displayed at reunions. Sometimes serving something bigger than yourself is the only success that really matters. The stars on my shoulders weren't just rank insignia. They were proof that some paths lead exactly where they're supposed to, even when everyone else thinks you're lost. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.